Hello and welcome back to Era 7 of the APUS History Curriculum. In this video, we'll be looking at Topic 7.3, the Spanish-American War, in particular focusing on the effects of that war, more so than the battles and such. It's because of this war that America becomes a global empire. So let's get to it. A key thing to know about this time period is that Cuba was one of the few remaining Spanish colonies left in the Western Hemisphere. Most of its previous colonies had long since declared independence. Spain, however, wanted to hold on to Cuba and had sent General Valeriano Butcher Weyler to take steps to stop any rebellion, of which there had been rumblings for more than a decade. He went so far as to establish concentration camps for suspected rebels, in which many Cubans died of starvation and disease. The U.S. was concerned about the happenings in Cuba because of huge investments in sugar plantations there, as well as any possible problems that revolution or poor rule could have on the prospects of building a canal across the Isthmus of Panama. And of course there was the sympathy for the plight of the Cuban people amongst many Americans, due largely in part to the influence of yellow journalism, such as that practiced by men like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. Yellow journalism was characterized by exaggerated sensationalistic reporting, because the primary purpose of a newspaper corporation was to make money, and they did that by selling as many papers as they could. So, sensationalizing the news sold papers. In February of 1898, Hearst published a stolen private letter written by the Spanish minister to the United States in Washington, Dupuy de Long. The letter portrayed President McKinley as corrupt and weak, suggesting that Spain was not going to institute any reforms in Cuba, no matter what the U.S. said. The American public was outraged, and de Long was forced to resign. Because of continued concern about U.S. citizens in Cuba, though, President McKinley agreed to have one of America's newest and most powerful battleships, the USS Maine, travel to Havana to observe the goings-on in Cuba. The ship would be able to evacuate American citizens if there were danger, but also was an expression of the U.S. popular distaste for Spain's reconcentration policies. For a few weeks, nothing happened. Then in the middle of the night, on February 15, 1898, the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing over 250 sailors. Both the U.S. and the Spanish launched investigations. The U.S. concluded that it had to have been a Spanish mine or a bomb that had caused the explosion. The Spanish concluded that the explosion had to be internal and presumably accidental. Well, which one do you think is going to make American newspapers sell more papers? Which one would they seize on as the supposed truth? Naturally, American newspapers focused on the culpability of the Spanish, when actually the reality was that Spain's investigation was likely correct, an internal explosion, probably near a almost empty coal bunker, because coal dust was known to be explosive. But pushed by headlines in the Euro press, Americans clamored for war. "To hell with Spain, remember the Maine," became the rallying cry. President William McKinley was initially reluctant to declare war, as he had seen enough bloodshed when he'd served in the Civil War. Wall Street didn't particularly want war because of fears that it would interrupt trade. But pressure from the American people led to McKinley issuing an ultimatum to Spain. They would have to end the rebellion, recall Weyler, and grant Cuban independence or face war with the U.S. These were terms that Spain refused, and likely would never have agreed to. So McKinley asked Congress for, and got, a declaration of war in April of 1898. As part of the declaration of war, Congress passed the Teller Amendment, which specified that the U.S. was going to war against Spain to free Cuba, and would not take Cuba for themselves. Cuba would be an independent nation. Supporters of the war called it a splendid little war for the United States. It was very popular amongst volunteers and the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt. He even resigned his position to join an all-volunteer cavalry to join in the invasion of Cuba. Prior to his resignation, and actually even long prior to the declaration of war, Roosevelt had sent a cable to Commodore George Dewey, commander of the American fleet in the Pacific, to go to Manila in the Philippines, which was a Spanish colony, in the event of war. Actually, in the anticipation that there would be war. The Secretary of the Navy wasn't pleased, but since President McKinley agreed, Dewey sailed off. On May 1, 1898, after war had been declared, Dewey's 6 warships sailed into Manila Harbor and utterly destroyed the Spanish fleet anchored there. The Spanish lost over 400 men in all 10 ships, while the U.S. had just one casualty, and that was from heat stroke. A German fleet then arrived, and Dewey threatened them with war as well, and the Germans backed down. The U.S. brought in a Filipino leader named Emilio Aguinaldo to help raise up the people against the Spanish. Finally, on August 13, 1898, Dewey was able to get his forces on land and capture the city of Manila. Unbeknownst to him, however, was the fact that the U.S. and Spain had signed a ceasefire the day before. Because the U.S. then sought to apply its imperialist ideals to the Philippines, Aguinaldo later began a revolt against U.S. occupation that proved to last longer and be more costly than the entire Spanish-American War. In Cuba, which of course was the main point, U.S. troops were woefully unprepared for the fight, but the Spanish army was actually in worse shape. The Spanish fleet was blocked in at Santiago and was unable to prevent an American landing nearby. The Rough Riders, including Theodore Roosevelt, participated in a fierce battle at San Juan Hill, along with the support of 2 black regiments, which was about a quarter of the entire invading force. By July 1st, the Spanish fleet had been completely destroyed, and Cuba surrendered shortly thereafter. The U.S. then turned their attention to Puerto Rico, yet another Spanish colony, invading the island before the war with Spain was over. Many of the population there regarded the U.S. as liberating heroes. Just days later, the U.S. and Spain signed an armistice. In the Treaty of Paris of 1898 that formally concluded the war, Cuba was recognized as free from Spanish rule. The U.S. received the islands of Guam and Puerto Rico, but the Philippine issue required more negotiation. Technically, the U.S. was required to give it back since it had been captured after the ceasefire. But the U.S. feared that poor rule by the Spanish, and even retaliation against those who had helped America, was imminent. To solve this date problem, the U.S. agreed to pay Spain $20 million for the Philippines. Although McKinley recognized that the Philippines were a problem, he didn't want to risk either anarchy there or perhaps world war if Germany were to come in and seize control. The least of the evils was to take the Philippines and leave their independence until later. There was opposition to the U.S. occupation of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, but the market potential led to most of those being ignored. Once the U.S. stabilized the government on the island of Cuba, the U.S. withdrew according to the terms of the Teller Amendment. However, the U.S. did claim a permanent military base at Guantanamo Bay and forced Cuba to include the Platt Amendment in their constitution, which forced Cuba to not do anything that might inhibit their independence, gave the U.S. the right to review any Cuban treaties, and would also allow the U.S. to intervene to restore order should there be any future revolutions. The U.S. involvement with this war and the empire that was created in the aftermath, although small by European standards, did improve the U.S. position in the eyes of the European powers. The U.S. was able to build stronger ties with Britain, while Germany became more frustrated with the U.S. It also led to another rising sense of nationalism and patriotism, helped by the increasingly industrial and urban society. Once the U.S. came into possession of the Philippines, they had to decide what to do with them. Emilio Aguinaldo thought and expected that the Philippines would be treated the same as Cuba, and that the U.S. planned to set the Philippines free. And remember, we didn't do that right away with the Cubans, so the fact that we didn't do it right away with the Philippines wasn't that big of a worry. But the U.S. didn't feel that the Philippines were capable of governing themselves, and set about establishing a government and an infrastructure for them, an ideological position that put Euro-American society as superior to that of Native societies. Something that isn't all that much different than the way we treated Native American peoples now, is it? Open rebellion to U.S. rule began in February of 1899 and continued for several years, costing thousands of American and Filipino lives. The U.S. response to the guerrilla warfare was to become almost as the Spanish had been in Cuba, as they sought to hold on to the Philippines at all cost. The U.S. even went so far as to establish concentration camps to house Filipino civilians. The insurrection would finally be broken when Emilio Aguinaldo was captured in 1901. The Philippines, though, they were eventually granted their freedom and independence, but not until July 4th, 1946. One of the reasons the U.S. was adamant about hanging on to the Philippines was that it would provide a route of proximity to China. China had recently lost a war to Japan and was now the subject of European colonization and influence. Most of the powers battling for control of China were trying to make separate spheres of influence in the region. The U.S., fearing losing out, wanted to keep an open door to trade in China. Secretary of State John Hay urged all the great European powers to keep this open door to trade with other nations, especially the U.S., in what came to be referred to as the Open Door Notes. It was widely praised here in the U.S., but really wasn't that supported by European powers, so essentially the policy was relatively short-lived. But the U.S. did not actually end its involvement with just a trade relationship in foreign diplomacy. As millions of Chinese were angry with this open-door policy and forced domination by European powers, a super-patriotic group within China, nicknamed the Boxers by the West, attacked missionaries and diplomats, besieging them in the capital of Beijing. A multinational force made up of troops from Japan, Russia, Britain, France, Germany, and the U.S. went in to put down this rebellion. These allies were ultimately victorious, and China was forced to pay an indemnity of over $300 million. The U.S. share alone was over $24 million. Although, actually, the U.S. felt their share was excessive because they'd only had about 2,500 men there, and they actually returned most of it. China, quite appreciative of that gesture from the United States, set aside that money to send Chinese students to the U.S., and these students would play a significant role in westernizing the Far East in the century to come. In the aftermath of the Boxer Rebellion, though, Secretary Hay emphasized the need to maintain the territorial integrity of China. Eventually, the European powers concurred, but not really because of the demands of the Boxers, but more because of their distrust of one another. Well, that's what you need to know about Topic 7.3, the Spanish-American War, and its effects. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.